Morning, brothers and sisters. This is Castillo-Romero, and I pray that my talk serve to stir up sagging spirits. I pray that my talk serve to encourage those who are very weary at this point. I pray that my talk would serve to stoke your zeal and make you want to love God more. In 1972, 591 prisoners of war were released after the Vietnam Peace Agreement was signed in Feb of 1972, that is. And from Vietnam, the prisoners of war were flown, from Vietnam, they were flown to Clark Air Base, where they would be debriefed before being flown back to mainland USA. And the local and international journalists, of course, were quick to pick up the scent. And they were here even before the plane arrived. As soon as the prisoners of war got off the plane, the journalists swarmed around them and asked them questions left and right. And so there was no formal interview, like walang set, walang TV set, walang sit-down interview. It was just like they were being interviewed on the fly while they were walking around, while they were going from point to point. They were being interviewed. And from these interviews, from these questions, and from the answers to these questions, we learned awful, horrid things about what they went through in that prison camp in Vietnam. The prisoners of war were tortured severely and repeatedly. So they were tortured just enough to leave them almost dead, but not dead. So tinorture sila, pinahirapan sila, binugbog sila to the point na lupay-pay na sila, pero humihinga pa sila. Kasi the next day, bububugin sila ulit. They were dehydrated. They were starved. Pagdating nila dito, dami sa kanila talagang super malnourished. And from the accounts of the prisoners of war, they said they were thrown into isolation cells, two kinds of isolation cells. One was so small, so cramped, and one of the prisoners of war shared that he only had enough room to sit on a ledge and rest his back. He had no room to move his arms. He was that close, and if he stood up, he came this close to the door. So wala talagang room, nakakaloka yun, di ba? Yung ganun lang kaliit. And then all he could do was stand up, sit down, stand up, sit down. And if the other kind pala of isolation cell was one that was in complete darkness, and prisoners of war were left to stay in this dark isolation cell without any light for weeks and weeks on end. So that not having light like that for so long can really weaken you. In sarcastic humor, the prisoners called the prison camp the Hanoi Hilton. Parang ginawa na lang nilang biro na they were living in the Hanoi Hilton. But we all know now that the living conditions in this hotel was hellish, was inhuman. Now, why have I brought this thing up about the Vietnam prisoners of war? I brought it up, brothers and sisters, because in a very real sense, we are prisoners of war. In a very real sense, we find ourselves in a war that's going on in our lives, or sometimes even several wars. Now, one of the wars that we have ongoing is this pandemic, and it has held us captive for how long? For like two years, no? We are all held against our will. There are many more things that we should be doing, need to be doing, but the pandemic limits us. We're just here. It's held us captive. But brothers and sisters, merong ilan sa atin, merong mga tao na hindi lang yung pandemic ang gera sa buhay nila. For some of us, in addition to the pandemic, we have other wars going on inside us, other wars that make it so difficult for us, other wars that make us feel defeated. This can be a difficult child. It can be a sick or aging parent. It can be a terrible diagnosis that's been pronounced on you. It can be a betrayal of your trust. It can be a broken relationship. It can be financial reversals. Nevertheless, some of us feel that ang tagal na natin lumalaban. Ang tagal na natin nakikibaka sa buhay natin. At dito ko gusto isingit yung sakit ko. Multiple sclerosis, or MS is its nickname. Multiple sclerosis is a degenerative and disabling disease involving the brain and the spinal cord. It's characterized by lesions, and these lesions cause short circuits all over my body. So a good way to picture it is to picture an appliance that's plugged, pero yung wire niya sugat-sugat or may gashes, kaya nag-short circuit. So it's plugged, it's working, but it's not working right. Essentially, that's what MS does to my body. The very first symptoms to appear were vision problems. At that time, I was learning to play tennis and I couldn't gauge where the ball was, and I couldn't get it. I couldn't make my movements sabay with the ball. Sabi ng pulag boy sa akin, "Ma'am, ang labo ng timing mo, ma'am. Wala pa yung bola, pumapalo ka na. Or nakalampas na yung bola, saka ka palang umaastang papalo." So nakita ko, I could not tell how near or how far something was from me. So obviously I had a problem with depth of vision. The other vision problem I had, the other vision issue I had was called diplopia. It's a double vision. Double vision, ibig sabihin nun. My husband and I used to go on long distance biking rides. And it was on one of those bike rides that I noticed that I was seeing two of everything. I would look at a policeman, but I would see two. I would look at an outpost that I had seen before, and I was seeing two outposts. I would see two traffic lights hanging, and actually not separately, but they were more like overlapping each other. Ganon yung double vision. They were overlapping. The people or things that I looked at were overlapping. And over time, more symptoms began to show up. Like one symptom was I had balls of electricity running down from my head down to my left. Like if I moved my head to look down at something or to pick up something, there'd be really strong electrical current that would shoot down. And it was strong enough to make me lose my balance. I was dropping things. Kahit na hawak ko na. I remember one time I was in Busan and I dropped a perfume bottle that I was already holding. My left leg, I could not control it. It felt like it had weights tied onto it. Mabigat siya. I was dragging it. My gait was very unsteady. Hindi ako makalakad ng diretso. Pag naglakad ako pagyewang-gewang, it looked like I had had one drink too many. And I thought about these symptoms as they were coming up. And I recall that back in high school, I had fallen off a horse and I had similar symptoms. So I thought, okay, umuulit. I know I diagnosed myself. I have a pinched nerve. And so I went to see an orthopedist friend of my uncle, Dr. Silao. Siya yung sikat na orthopedist in those days. And he did a lot of tests on me. But after they were all done, he said, there's nothing wrong with you orthopedically. I think you need to see a neurologist. So he referred me to a neurologist and I went. And again, many tests were done. They had the brain scan done. So they found the brain, but they didn't find any abnormality. They did myelogram, yun yung they put a dye into your spine and then move you, they strap you onto a bed and they move you different directions and see. I don't know what they're looking at. But anyway, that's what a myelogram is. Again, they didn't find anything conclusive. So mahabang diagnosis ito, no, yung sa MS ko. I mean, I didn't have all those tests in one go. It was spread over time. And at the end, one doctor said to me, your symptoms are absurd. He said, you have a non-specific virus. And I felt, wow, it's causing me so much trouble. It doesn't even have a name. And it bothered me that they couldn't figure out what it was. It really bothered me. It made me feel bad because I felt there was a kind of reproach in that. Parang may nakatagong reproach. It made me feel like, they didn't say it, but it made me feel like I was a malingerer, that I was inventing symptoms. So nung nandun na, at that point, I said, I don't want to see doctors anymore. If yan lang pala sasabihin nila sa akin, I could have, done it myself. I could have done without them. So I stopped seeing doctors and I stopped talking about whatever it was I was feeling going on in my body. I didn't talk to anyone about it. But then about 8 months later, I started to have problems emptying my bladder. Yes. And I went to my OB, Dr. Isidro, and she temporarily made me use an indwelling catheter. Pero after she had done that, she said, hindi ito pwedeng forever. I want you to see a neuro friend of mine who is in town in USC. His name is Dr. Navarro, and he's involved in a research institute for demyelinating diseases in Japan, and he's here for a visit. I want you to go and see him. So my husband and I went to UST. Several trips din yun. And I remember na nakawan pa kami ng gulong dun eh. Anyway, the clinical tests that Dr. Navarro did made him conclude that, sabi niya, although the CT scan didn't show anything, he said that he was confident that what I had was something called multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis, that was the first time I had heard the word. And since Navarro was going back to Japan in a couple of weeks, he suggested that I see another neuro friend of his, Dr. Tenchavez. Now, Dr. Tenchavez, of all the doctors I had previously been to, Dr. Tenchavez was the most avid listener. He listened, he wanted me to talk about every detail that I was feeling, and he talagang conscientiously took down notes. I mean, by hand. Ngayon kasi di ba they type it. Dr. Tenchavez would take down everything by hand, and he listened carefully, and as he listened, he would perform clinical tests on me. He drew a line on the sole of my feet, and then he watched how my feet spread out like that, my toes spread out like that. Then he made notes. He checked on my eyes inside the light, and he made notes. He made me point to my nose, yung ganito alternately with my eyes closed, and then again he made notes. Because I was very, very thorough and very conscientious. At the end of the tests, he said, I think you have a neurological disorder. So he ordered for me to have a lumbar tap, and I did. He made me go for a VER, a visual evoked response test, to check on my eyes, an NCV, a nerve conduction velocity test, to check on the nerve conduction around my body. And finally, brothers and sisters, in 1986, nung meron ng MRI sa Makati Med, he said, go have the MRI. I'm sure the MRI will pick up what you have. True enough, the verdict came out, multiple sclerosis. I wasn't happy to have a strange sounding illness, but it was a relief to know that I wasn't imagining things, that everything I reported was legit. I wasn't ecstatic that, wow, may sakit pala ako. Hindi. I was sad that I was sick, but at least all the symptoms that other doctors labeled as absurd, all the symptoms that they couldn't figure out, all the symptoms that I thought I was beginning to think I was imagining them, every single one of them coincided with the lesions found by the MRI, detected by the MRI. Can you imagine? Lahat ng pinag-uusapan ko nagtugma-tugma, lahat ng nire-report ko na symptoms nagtugma-tugma with the MRI. So it was a great relief. Now the neuro had to sit me down to discuss the MRI with me. He showed me the different parts of my brain that had lesions. It's a little surreal when you're sitting down on a chair and then you're viewing your brain on a screen in front of you. And anyway, he showed me the different parts of my brain. Sabi niya, ito yung cerebellum. Tingnan mo, yan, may mga lesions. Ito yung brainstem. Ang dami ring lesions. Ito yung medulla. Meron ding lesions. Ito yung lobe. frontal lobe and ganyan-ganyan. Basta, lahat may lesions. And then I saw one part that didn't have lesions at all. So I said, walang galos. So I asked him, Doc, ano yung part ng brain yun na, yung brain ko na walang lesions? And he looked at it, he said, it's strange that it has no lesions there because MS affects the whole brain. Actually, you get lesions everywhere. But here, this one is really clear. This part is called the gray matter, or the cerebral cortex, or some other term. But what it is, what gray matter is, it's responsible for cognition. It's responsible for comprehension. It's responsible for understanding. And so who can do that? Who can do that, brothers and sisters? Give me a sickness that affects the brain but protects a part of the brain, and that part that gets protected is the part that allows me to understand what God is doing, or to understand that God is up to something. If I had lesions in my brain, in my cerebral cortex, if I had lesions in my gray matter as far as 1986, as far back as 1986, I would not be giving you this talk. I could not. I would not understand it. I would not know anything about my MS. I would not have no insight at all. And so I just want to put that in. Who can do that? But who can do that? Who can arrange for that? Only God. Anyway, as I sat listening to the doctor, I was trying to keep myself cool and composed, and I did, except he kept repeating the words degenerative, disabling, degenerative, disabling. Ito, para kang inuubos dito. It got me, some horrible emotion inside me was building up. And I wanted to know ano yung degenerative? What does that exactly mean? And, how does it happen? And he said, well, it's not the same for everyone who has MS. Iba-iba yan. And the speed of degeneration differs also from person to person, and added that later on he added, you may eventually lose the use of your arms and legs. So that's where I got stuck. I got stuck at that point when he said, eventually lose the use of your arms and legs. And I remember that he kept going, explaining prognosis and other things about the MS, but I remember that I interrupted him to ask him, Doctor, how long before this happens? And he said, before what happens? And I said, the part where you're saying that I would eventually lose the use of my arms and legs. And it was important to me to know, brothers and sisters, because in that year, I had two little girls. In 1986, I already had two little girls. And from what I was listening to him saying about it being degenerative, it really caused me so much sadness to know that my two little girls would be saddled with a mom that would be bedridden and constantly needing care. Parang hindi ko ma-take. I was thinking, I need to know when para maihabilin ko sila. Like, who's gonna explain to them about the menstrual period? Who's going to buy their beginner's bra? I mean, these are stuff that mothers take care of. And then I wouldn't be there. So I needed an answer. I said, when? I mean, how long? How long before this happens? Just give me a ballpark figure. Kahit medyo-medyo lang, doctor. And he said, 15 to 20 years. And when I heard this, I was shocked, but I didn't pray. I was afraid, but I didn't pray. I was anxious, but I didn't pray. And let me tell you, I started attending prayers. I started attending prayer meetings as early as 1975. So by the time the official diagnosis of MS came out, it was 1986. That's a good 11 years of praying and doing scripture study daily. So, di ba? Doing scripture study for 11 years, praying with people and walking among Christians, like-minded people for 11 years. And yet, you would think that after 11 years of that kind of activity, I would be pious and serene. I would be really spiritual. I would be prayerful. And yet, that's not what happened. I mean, that's not how I met That's not the attitude I met MS with. I went from angry to sad to depressed to angry to sad to depressed to angry again. Yun lang iniikutan ko. Galit na galit ako or nalulungkot ako. And in fact, one of my brothers said, ayaw niya akong kausapin at that time kasi nanlilisik daw yung mga mata ko. Tsaka nagdadabog ako. So, but so pwede pala yon, brothers and sisters, pwede palang 11 years ka nang nagdadasal, 11 years ka nang nagpe-prayer meeting, 11 years ka nang nagba-Bible reading, and yet at a time of difficulty, at a time of serious difficulty, your first reaction is not one of turning to the Lord. My first reaction was not like that. My first reaction was to turn to myself. I said, not if I can help it. So I was attempting to meet this, to fix this again on my own. So I didn't turn to God, I turned to me. Yet, having said that, I just want to say that even if I'm not a perfect Christian, even if ang dami pang mayabang sa kaloob-looban ko, I cannot speak of MS without referring to God. I cannot take God out of the equation. It's just, I cannot. God is so much a part of this. I mean, I've learned so much from God in this illness. So I may not be an ideal spirit-controlled woman, but I'm in a relationship with God enough to allow me to see His hand in my difficulty. What are the symptoms I have? Okay, I'll just go over some symptoms. I have pins and needles, 24/7. Pins and needles is what you get when you hit your elbow, di ba? You have that kuryente here, or if you sit on your leg for too long, you're gonna get pins and needles. That's I have that 24/7 until the left side of my face. I have what doctors call a subluxating hip. My left leg comes off the hip socket. When I walk, it comes off the hip socket. So kung baga sa kotse, ball joint, lumalabas siya, kumakalas siya. Pero noon, nag-uumpisa pa lang yan, my daughters would push it and it would snap back in place. Or I would hit the wall with my hip and it would snap back in place. I had added to that, I had extreme tightness around my torso, like I had a metal thing tied around me, which made it hard to breathe, but I could breathe. I have problems with balance. I had problems with balance and I still have problems with balance, which is why I need to be in a wheelchair because hindi ako lumpo. I can walk, my legs are okay, but I keep falling. So I'm better off in a wheelchair. I have swallowing difficulties, not painful swallowing, but yung pag may nilunok ako, pag lumunok ako, parang hindi bumababa agad, parang mabagal siya. Ganon. So it's not painful, but slow. And I just learned that I just need to relax and wait for it kasi bababa din naman. I have shrill microphone feedback sounds going on and on again the whole day. Ganun lang siya, on and off, on and on. Not all day, but it will go on. Then, mamaya meron na naman, ganun. I have an assortment of pain that comes in varying degrees. I have pain behind my head. I have pain inside my ears, hindi ko ma-explain. I have pain behind my eyeballs. Basta maraming klaseng pain. And then I have MS, what's called MS fatigue. I go to sleep dead tired and I wake up still dead tired. Parang hindi ako nakatulog. I have ataxia. I'm clumsy in the kitchen. I'm clumsy with fine movements there. That's what ataxia is, or ataxia. I'm clumsy with fine movements. So when I dice vegetables, when I'm preparing meals, I have to be very focused and mindful of what I'm doing when I'm holding a knife. So pag nagtatagtad ako ng bawang ganyan, kailangan talaga nakakoncentrate ako. Kasi kung hindi, minsan yung mga dulo na ng daliri ko yung natatatad ko. If I focus on threading a needle, I start shaking. Just at that point that I'm about to get it in, it starts shaking. That's called an intention tremor. I have jerks, like I suddenly, move, surge forward like that. I have tremors. when I have tremors on my legs, when my legs start shaking or my hands start shaking, like as if I had Parkinson's, I just have to sit down and wait for it to pass. When it's hot, I slur. When it's hot, I slur. I have what's called foot drop. So foot drop is, your feet are like this, diba? My feet, if you leave it alone, it just droops down. It's also called the hoof syndrome because that's what my left leg looks like. It looks like a hoof. And because of that, I trip over myself very often. I also have spasticity. Spasticity causes me pain. It's a kind of cramping, like the pain that you get from cramps is like the pain is like spasticity, except spasticity is the whole time. The entire time the stiffness is there, and the entire time it's painful. But here's another interesting thing. If I told you about the God protecting the cerebral cortex, okay, here with the spasticity, when I went to a doctor of physical therapy to parang fix it or to give me medication for it or to to assess it, sabi nung doctor sa akin, wow, you're very spastic. You need to be medicated. Let me write Dr. Tenchavez. So he wrote Dr. Tenchavez and said, this girl needs to be put on baclofen or whatever. For the spasticity. Kasi sabi niya, ang hirap niyan. You're always in pain. Tataas blood pressure mo, blah, blah, blah. Now, then I took the note to my doctor, to my neurologist. He said, Roseanne, I know that, but I can't put you on medicine because if I put you on medicine, your muscles are going to relax and wala ka nang magagawa. So the stiffness that comes from spasticity is what allows me to stand. It's what allows me to grip glass kasi stiff siya. So meron na yung muscle ko to hold the glass. So it's what allows me to move around, which is what I like to do. So who can do that? Take something bad like spasticity, take something bad that needs to be medicated and yet make it work for my good. Who can do that? Only God, di ba? So again, people ask me, masakit pa yung spasticity? Yes, masakit. Meron bang pain ng MS? Yes. After 36 years, all I can say is, hindi ko ma-explain ang MS sa mga tao nagtatanong. So I say, may araw na masakit, may araw na mas masakit. May araw na masakit, may araw na mas masakit. Yun lang yung dalawa kong choice. Araw na masakit, araw na mas masakit. And brothers and sisters, consider this. This July marks my 36th year with MS. So I have had this for 36 years. Now, having spoken of this, let me now go back to the first thing that I opened with. I told you about the prisoners of war. I told you about MS, what it is, what it does to me, and how I see God's hand in it. But now let me go back to the prisoners of war, to that original story. The highest ranking officer that was held captive in Vietnam, in the Hilton Hanoi, was Commander James Bond Stockdale. He said that there were far more than just 591 prisoners of war. Sabi niya, konti pa ngayon marami. Except the other prisoners of war, hindi na sila umabot sa Clark kasi they died of natural causes. Like some of them died of, or many of them died of infections because they caught infections and then there was no medicine in the prison camp. So eventually, yun ang kinamatay nila, yung mga infections. But sabi ni Commander Stockdale, pero mas marami doon yung namatay na prisoners of war just because they wasted away. Just because they lost their will to live. No? So more prisoners died of just wasting away and more prisoners died of just losing their will to live. So the journalists asked, who were those people? Who were the first to waste away? And Commander Stockdale's answer is going to shock you as it shocked me. Sabi niya, the first to waste away were the optimists and the positive thinkers. Kakagulat, di ba? Why is that? And he said, because the positive thinkers daw and the optimists, they just pick things out of the air. They just make statements without looking at their situation. Parang hindi nila pinapansin yung nangyayari. They're just saying, no, kaya natin to. This is what's gonna happen. They keep spewing or they keep making positive statements, and they made statements like, this Christmas we will be rescued and released because it's the best season to be rescued and released. But Christmas came and they were not released. Christmas came and they were still there. Then they said, okay, this Easter, kasi bagong buhay. So, yan, tamang-tama yan sa theme ng Easter. We're gonna be set free. But they didn't get set free. Then they said the next date that they picked on was 4th of July. That's it. We're gonna be rescued on the 4th of July. Then it didn't happen. 4th of July came and went and they were still there. Then they said this Thanksgiving, because that is the best season. The season of Thanksgiving is going to be so momentous for us because we're going to be released for sure. But brothers and sisters, all their favorite seasons came and went, and they still found themselves dehydrated, starved, tortured, close to death, and stuffed into isolation rooms that were unbelievably cramped. So what's the point? So what am I saying? Am I saying that we should choose to be pessimists, brothers and sisters? No, that's not what I'm saying. It's far from what I'm saying. I'm saying that we all need hope, but not false hope. Faith is not the same thing as positive thinking. It's not the same as optimism. It's at best, it's similar. It's similar to positive thinking. It's similar to optimism. But magkahawig lang sila. They're not the same. Faith is based, and faith is drawn from hope in the Lord. It's not because good things will happen, but faith is drawn from hoping in the Lord. And true hoping in the Lord is found in God's word. In God's word that He will not abandon us. That's where our hope is founded on. That we have a God who will never abandon us, leave us for dead. That no matter what war or whatever war goes on in our life, He will be with us and He will see us through and He will preserve. But preserve what? Preserve our desire to eat out again, our desire to party and fellowship, our desire to shop in Uniqlo or in Rustan's or in SM. No, that's not what the Lord will preserve. The Lord will preserve our soul. And that's what should give us hope, because in the end, He's going to preserve us. That's our hope, and it goes beyond going out to eat or to shop or to fellowship. Our hope is that whether we're out of the pandemic of our life or in the midst of it, that God is with us, that He doesn't leave us alone. That's what our hope should be founded on. And there, I just listed a few lessons that I learned. I picked up from the prisoners of war. I learned from them that you need to do what you can in the circumstance that you're in. Whatever circumstance you're in, do what you can. So example, the prisoners of war were men with military disciplines, okay? So sa kanila, exercise is of utmost importance. It was critical for them to go for a run, to do push-ups, because it cleared their mind. It beefed up their muscles so that they would, be strong. But in an isolation cell, how are you going to exercise? How are you going to run? So you can whine and you complain that you can't do what you want to do in the circumstance that you're in. But from the prisoners of war, we learned that you can do what you can do. Whatever it is that your circumstances allows you to do it. So this guy who was sitting on the ledge within a little small room, all the exercise he could do was stand up and sit down, wiggle his toes and wiggle his fingers. That's all the exercise, and yet he did it. every single day. So wag ka nang nagdadrama about gusto ko sana tumakbo gusto ko sana mag-push up, gusto sana pumunta ng gym. Hindi nga pwede, so gawin mo what's there that you can do. Whatever it is that you can still do, do it. The other thing that I learned from them is prayer, the importance of prayer. I'm talking about real prayer. There's nothing wrong with memorized prayer. There's nothing wrong with novenas and litanies and things like that. Nothing wrong with that. But to have a personal conversation with God is critical. It's what allows you to see his hand. It's what allows you to talk to him openly with your heart wide open. The prisoners of war had military mindsets. These men were not prayer meeting goers. They did not have that mindset na parang, kailangan natin isa, let's do this. But sabi nila, once you are in a really, really dire situation, yun talagang, once hirap ka na, you learn to turn to God in prayer. You learn to acknowledge him in your situation. So brothers and sisters, what I'm saying is, it's your difficult circumstance that's going to make you learn to pray to God in a way that's going to make you overcome your difficult situation. So they were not people of prayerful mindsets. They were men of military mindsets. And yet, when they were in the direst of dire situations, they learned to turn to God in prayer. The other thing I want to bring up here is self-pity. Self-pity is something that's easy to spot in other people, but we fail to see it in ourselves. So if you have any difficulty, if you have any problem, you need to acknowledge that you will have a tendency to engage in self-pity or to wallow in self-pity. So you need to recognize that. And you need to allow yourself some time to feel bad. Like ako, there are days when I'm just so full of self-pity. I tell God, I want my old life back. I don't like this. I want my old life back. And yet, brothers and sisters, in prayer, because I've learned to have a personal conversation with God, I'm able to open my heart to him and tell him this stuff. And then after I've pitied myself enough, after I've felt bad, I then now I'm able to go into prayer and able to ask God to move me out of it. So it's good, it's okay to experience self-pity. Wag mo lang siyang gawing BFF. You need to find ways to fight it. Then another thing I learned from the prisoners of war is the importance of communicating, the importance of talking. And the prisoners of war, even while they were in isolation cells, they learned to communicate. They devised the tap code. They tapped on bars, on their prison bars. They tapped on walls. They tapped on the floor. They tapped out their cuentos. They tapped out their cuentos to each other. And one prisoner of war was known for all the funny anecdotes that he would tap, and it would send them all laughing. So can you imagine, ang tagal kaya mag-tap ng kwento, di ba? So siya, tinatap niya, mga kwento na paborito niyang kinikwento is yung kung paano siya, how his grandmother ran after him with the broom, all his mischievous deeds, how his grandmother would pull him by the ear, and he tapped that out. And all of them had a good laugh talking about the funny things in their childhood, remembering that. So yun, imagine na tinatap out nila, di ba ang tagal no? At pag natapos yung kwento ng katatap, tawanan sila. Gratefulness is something you need to remember to keep in your heart. Gratefulness is something you choose, and you need to look for things to be grateful for. It doesn't come naturally. It's not like rain that falls on you. Gratefulness is something that you look for. Brothers and sisters, when the devil unleashed COVID upon humanity, he thought that all of humanity would be miserable and curse God. Parang sa kanya, for sure, magagalit sila sa Panginoon for allowing this. Hindi na sila makakasimba. Hindi na sila pwede mag-prayer meeting. Hindi na sila pwede mag-fellowship. Hindi na sila pwede mag-cell group. Hindi na sila pwede mag-one-on-one. Dami na nilang hindi pwede gawin for sure. Pati birthday, hindi na sila pwede mag-celebrate. Wala nang parties, wala nang anniversary, wala nang wedding. But that's not what happened. That's not what happened. I mean, so we can be grateful that God made a way for us to survive COVID. How? Technology. So we have to be grateful that even if COVID hemmed us in and kept us in and constricted us, constrained us, we can be happy that because of technology, we have Zoom, merong Viber, merong WhatsApp, merong Messenger. We can continue to have meaningful conversations with each other. We can hear Mass. We can hear Mass. We can join novenas. Everything has happened online. So yung iniisip ni Satan na ikamamatay natin or magagalit, it would definitely separate us from God. That's not what happened. Tumindi palalo ang prayer meetings. Tumindi palalo ang pagsisimba. You can hear Mass several times a day. You can hear it, that kind of thing. We need to be grateful for that. Now, let me wind this up by talking about Commander Stockdale again. Many books have been written about the prisoners of war, and a lot of them make Commander Stockdale like a kind of superstar. Many things have been written about him, and one of them is the Stockdale paradox. Ano ba yung Stockdale paradox? Mahaba siya, but in so many words, the Stockdale paradox says that before you can have faith that results in peace, you need to learn to look at the difficult thing in your life squarely. Before you can have faith that results in peace, you need to look at the brutal facts, the ugly facts, the brutal reality of your adversity. Ano ba tong hinaharap mo? How big is it? How heavy is it? No, you don't look past it and create some fancy slogan. Some people do that. They go through a difficult thing and then parang binabaliwala nila. They say, wala yan, caring yan. Sisiw yan. Brothers and sisters, kung mahirap, wag natin sabihin madali. Kung mabigat, wag natin sabihin hindi mabigat. Wag natin sabihin caring. Let's look at our difficult circumstances squarely. Let's look at how big it looms over us. Let's look at how heavy it is. Let's look at the potential of evil it can bring into our life. But let's look to God, who is always bigger than any adversity, any difficult circumstance that you might go through. Let's look at God, the only one who will never leave you. And that's the thought I want to leave you with, brothers and sisters. We have a God who will never leave us, and we have a God who will see us through every difficult, impossible circumstance in our life. I pray that you would realize this and move according to this. Yung parang really just facing things, but really looking up to God. Thank you, brothers and sisters. Salamat for giving me this chance to speak to you.